A killer's vow to protect an angel. Alessandra Romano had been raised to be a queen, not a prisoner. But when her father lost everything, she became the price of his betrayal. Now, she belonged to Dario Benedetti, a man known for breaking those who crossed him. He ran a finger along her throat, his voice dark with amusement. "You're not leaving, Dulcezza," he murmured. "Not until I decide you're worth keeping." Chapter 1. The Price of Betrayal. The ornate, gilded cage was still a cage. Alessandra Romano traced the intricate carvings of the mahogany headboard, the plush velvet drapes a suffocating reminder of her gilded prison. From the window, the sprawling estate of Dario Benedetti glittered under the Tuscan sun, a deceptive beauty masking the darkness that now held her captive. Just yesterday, she had been Alessandra Romano, daughter of Lorenzo Romano, a respected if secretly faltering capofamiglia. Today, she was nothing more than a pawn, a debt repaid in flesh and blood. Her father's face, etched with a mixture of shame and desperation, flashed before her eyes. He had tried to hide it, the mounting debts, the desperate gamble to regain his former glory. He had always been a proud man, too proud to admit defeat, even to his own daughter. He'd sworn he could handle it, that the alliance he'd brokered with the upstart Sal DeMarco would secure their family's future. He hadn't. DeMarco, a viper in tailored suits, had played them all. He'd used Lorenzo's ambition, his desperation, as a weapon, twisting the knife slowly, deliberately, until Lorenzo was backed into a corner with no escape. And the price of his failure? Alessandra. The memory of the meeting, the cold, sterile boardroom where her fate had been sealed, still sent shivers down her spine. Dario Benedetti, the man who now held her life in his hands, had barely glanced at her. He'd sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, a predator surveying his prize, his dark eyes assessing, calculating. He hadn't spoken a word to her, his silence more terrifying than any threat. DeMarco, smug and victorious, had outlined the terms, his voice dripping with oily satisfaction. Lorenzo, his face ashen, had only nodded, unable to meet his daughter's gaze. "She is yours, Benedetti," DeMarco had declared, the words echoing in the sterile silence of the room. A fitting compensation for Romano's misjudgment. Benedetti had finally looked at her then, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It wasn't a look of lust or even interest, but something colder, something that spoke of possession, of absolute control. A chill had settled deep in Alessandra's bones, a premonition of the darkness to come. The transfer had been swift, brutal. No tearful goodbyes, no whispered promises of rescue. She had been handed over like a piece of valuable property, her father's shame her only dowry. The drive to Benedetti's estate had been a blur of fear and disbelief. The imposing gates, the armed guards, the sheer scale of the opulent mansion, it was a world away from the comfortable, if slightly faded, elegance of her own home. Now, hours later, the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was a prisoner, a captive of a man known for his ruthlessness, a man who controlled a vast empire built on fear and intimidation. She knew the stories, the whispers that circulated even among the insulated circles of the famiglia. Dario Benedetti was not a man to be crossed. He was a collector of debts, a breaker of wills. She ran a hand over the silk sheets, the luxurious fabric a stark contrast to the cold dread that gripped her heart. She had been raised to be strong, to be a Romano, to uphold the family name with dignity and grace. But now, stripped of everything she had known, she felt terrifyingly vulnerable. A soft knock on the door startled her. A young woman, barely older than Alessandra herself, entered, her eyes downcast, her movements hesitant. "Signora Benedetti, Signor Benedetti requests your presence at dinner," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Alessandra's stomach churned.
Signora Benedetti.
The title felt alien, mocking. She was no one's wife, least of all his. But she knew she had no choice. To refuse would be an act of defiance, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face the consequences. She rose from the bed, smoothing down the silk dress that had been laid out for her a deep emerald green that accentuated her dark hair and pale skin. It was another reminder of her status, a beautiful cage designed to contain her. As she followed the young woman down the grand staircase, the scent of rich food and expensive cologne filled the air. The sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from the dining room, a jarring counterpoint to the turmoil within her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She might be a prisoner, but she would not be broken. She would face Dario Benedetti with her head held high, a Romano to the very end. Even if that end was closer than she could ever have imagined. The question that burned within her was simple, sharp, and all-consuming. Could she find a way to survive this gilded prison, or would she become another casualty of the brutal world she had been forced into? Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark Mansion. The dining room was a study in opulent excess. A massive crystal chandelier cast a glittering light on the long, polished table laden with silver cutlery, delicate china, and an array of dishes that would have made a king envious. The walls were adorned with priceless artwork, the air thick with a scent of old money and power. But all Alessandra could see was him. Dario Benedetti sat at the head of the table, his dark hair gleaming in the candlelight, his features sharp and predatory. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and lean physique. He looked up as she entered, his eyes, the color of deep, stormy seas, locking onto hers. There was a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, amusement, perhaps, or a hint of challenge. He gestured to the seat opposite him, his voice a low, smooth rumble that sent a shiver down her spine despite her best efforts to remain composed. Alessandra. Welcome. The word welcome felt like a cruel joke. She took her seat, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. She could feel his gaze on her, assessing, dissecting. It was unnerving, this sense of being under a microscope, every flaw and vulnerability exposed. You must be hungry, he said finally, breaking the silence. He gestured to the array of dishes before them.
Please, eat.
She picked at the food, her appetite non-existent. The rich flavors seemed to mock her. A reminder of the life of luxury she was now forced to endure, a life built on the ruins of her own. She watched him eat, his movements precise and controlled, his expression unreadable. He seemed utterly at ease, as if holding a young woman captive was the most natural thing in the world. My father, she began, her voice barely a whisper. Is he? He didn't look up. Your father is alive.
For now.
The coldness of his words sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She knew what that meant. Lorenzo's life was hanging by a thread, dependent on her compliance, her submission. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. He finally looked at her, his eyes piercing. Obedience, he said softly. Loyalty. And perhaps entertainment. The last word was laced with a hint of something dangerous, something that made her skin crawl. She met his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to show him her fear. I am not yours to entertain, she said, her voice stronger now. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. You are mine in every way that matters, Dulcezza, he said, his voice a low purr. You belong to me now. Your father made sure of that. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to break free from this gilded cage. But she knew it was futile. She was trapped, caught in a web of power and control that she couldn't hope to escape. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over her. You are very beautiful, Alessandra, he said, his voice softening slightly. A rare flower, indeed. It would be a shame to see such beauty wither. The compliment, if it could be called that, felt like another threat. She knew what he was implying. He wanted her to play the part, to be the docile, obedient captive. He wanted her to surrender. I will not wither, she said, her voice firm. I am stronger than you think. He smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that didn't reach his eyes.
We shall see, he said.
The rest of the meal passed in a tense silence. She barely touched her food, her mind racing, trying to find a way out, a crack in the armor of her captor. But there was nothing. He was too powerful, too controlled. After dinner, he led her to a lavishly decorated sitting room, the walls lined with books, a grand piano gleaming in the corner. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, offering her one. She shook her head, refusing his offer. He shrugged and took a sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "You remind me of someone," he said, his voice thoughtful.
Who?
She asked, intrigued despite herself. He hesitated, a flicker of something dark crossing his face. "Someone I once knew. Someone who was taken from me." The words were cryptic, but they hinted at a past, a vulnerability that she hadn't expected. She sensed a story there, a wound that had never fully healed. "I am sorry," she said, the words genuine. He looked at her, surprised.
"Why?"
he asked. "Because loss is a heavy burden to bear," she said softly. "I know that better than most." A flicker of something that might have been respect crossed his face. He set down his glass, the silence stretching between them once more. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't the suffocating silence of power and control, but something more human. He walked over to the window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. "This house, it holds many secrets, Alessandra," he said, his voice low. "Many ghosts." She followed his gaze, her eyes drawn to the shadows that danced among the trees. She could feel it, the weight of the past, the unspoken stories that lingered in the air. This was more than just a prison, it was a mausoleum of memories, a place where darkness and beauty intertwined. And she was now a part of it, whether she liked it or not. She had to be careful the beauty might blind her to the treacherous depths of her new reality. And one misstep was all it took to disappear completely. Chapter 3. A Glimmer of Defiance. The days that followed settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Alessandra was given the freedom to explore the mansion and its grounds, but it was a freedom within strict confines. Guards were ever present, their eyes following her every move, a constant reminder of her captivity. She was treated with a chilling courtesy, the servants addressing her as Signora Benedetti, a title that grated on her nerves with each utterance. She spent hours in the vast library, losing herself in the pages of ancient books, seeking solace in the stories of others. The library became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape, however briefly, from the reality of her situation. She discovered hidden alcoves, forgotten manuscripts, and a sense of peace she hadn't expected to find. She also explored the gardens, vast and meticulously manicured, with hidden pathways, fountains, and secluded grottos. It was a place of beauty, but also a place of shadows, where secrets seemed to whisper on the wind. She often found herself drawn to a small, overgrown rose garden, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the estate. The roses, neglected and wild, were a poignant reminder of her own lost freedom. Dario Benedetti remained an enigma. He was often absent, consumed by the business of his empire, the details of which were never shared with her. When he was present, he was distant, aloof, his eyes holding a guardedness that she couldn't penetrate. He treated her with a chilling politeness, a constant reminder of the power he held over her. But there were moments, fleeting and unpredictable, when the mask seemed to slip. A flicker of something that might have been kindness in his eyes, a softening of his voice, a hint of vulnerability that she couldn't quite decipher. One evening, she found him in the music room, sitting at the grand piano, his fingers moving over the keys with a surprising grace. The melody was haunting, melancholic, a reflection of a soul she hadn't known existed. She stood in the doorway, listening, captivated by the unexpected beauty. He stopped playing when he saw her, his expression closing off, the vulnerability replaced by his usual guardedness. "You play beautifully," she said, her voice soft. He shrugged, dismissing her compliment. "It is a distraction," he said. "From what?" she asked, daring to probe further. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "From everything," he said. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. She sensed a loneliness in him, a deep-seated sadness that mirrored her own. It was a connection, however fragile, a shared understanding of loss and isolation. She took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "You don't have to be alone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, surprised, his expression softening slightly. "And what makes you think I want company?" he asked, a hint of challenge in his voice. "Because everyone needs someone," she said, her voice firm. "Even you." He laughed, a short, bitter laugh that held no mirth. "You know nothing about me, Alessandra," he said.
"Perhaps not," she said.
"But I know what it's like to be trapped, to feel like you have no one." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching, probing. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a nearby chair. She sat, her heart still racing. He began to play again, the melody this time less melancholic, more hopeful. She listened, captivated, feeling a connection to him that she couldn't explain. As the music filled the room, she realized that she was beginning to see him not just as her captor, but as a man, a complex, flawed human being with his own demons and his own hidden wounds. And in that realization, a glimmer of defiance began to flicker within her. She might be a prisoner, but she would not be a victim. She would find a way to survive, to navigate this dangerous world, and perhaps even to find her own freedom. This tiny crack in his exterior gave her a sliver of purpose, a purpose beyond mere survival. She started to wonder if there were a game bigger, more impactful, and more dangerous than what was in plain sight. Chapter 4. The Weight of His Gaze. The fleeting moment of connection in the music room, however subtle, had shifted something between them. It hadn't erased the fundamental power imbalance, the stark reality of her captivity, but it had introduced a new element into their interactions, a hesitant, fragile understanding. Dario remained a man of few words, his emotions carefully guarded, his true intentions hidden beneath layers of control. But his gaze, that intense, penetrating gaze that had once filled her with dread, now held a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or even a reluctant respect. He began to include her in small, seemingly insignificant ways. He would ask her opinion on a book he was reading, or a piece of music he was considering. He would invite her to join him on his evening walks through the gardens, their conversations stilted at first, but gradually becoming more comfortable. She learned more about him, not through direct revelations, but through observation, through the careful piecing together of fragments of information. She discovered his passion for art, his knowledge of history, his surprisingly dry sense of humor. She saw the way he interacted with his men, a mixture of authority and respect, a loyalty that ran deep. She also saw the darkness that clung to him, the shadows that haunted his eyes, the unspoken grief that seemed to weigh him down. She sensed a deep-seated loneliness, a yearning for something he couldn't, or wouldn't, name. One evening, as they were walking through the rose garden, he stopped and plucked a single, half-wilted bloom, its petals bruised and faded. He held it out to her, his expression unreadable. "It reminds me of you," he said, his voice low. She took the rose, her fingers brushing against his. "Broken?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. He shook his head. "Resilient," he said. "Beautiful, even in its imperfection." The compliment, so unexpected, so different from his usual guardedness, caught her off guard. She looked at the rose, its fragile beauty a mirror of her own situation. She had been broken, yes, but she was not destroyed. She was still alive, still fighting, still holding onto a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. The silence stretched between them, charged with an unspoken tension. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the pull of something dangerous and alluring. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between fear and fascination. She was drawn to him, to the mystery of him, to the vulnerability that he tried so hard to hide. But she was also terrified of him, of the power he held over her, of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. One afternoon, she found him in the library, poring over a stack of old documents. He looked up as she entered, his expression weary. Trouble? She asked, her voice hesitant. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. Always, he said. The burden of leadership. She saw the lines of fatigue etched on his face, the weight of responsibility that he carried. It was a reminder that he was not just a captor, but a man burdened by the demands of his world. Can I help? She asked, surprising even herself. He looked at her, surprised. I doubt it, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. These are not matters for delicate sensibilities. She bristled at his words. I am not as delicate as you think, she said, her voice firm. I have survived worse. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes assessing. Perhaps you have, he said finally. He gestured to the documents. These are old family records, he explained. Accounts, ledgers, contracts, the history of the Benedetti famiglia. She approached the table, her curiosity piqued. She picked up one of the documents, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The writing was in Italian, a formal, elegant script that she could decipher with some effort. It's fascinating, she said, her eyes scanning the page. A glimpse into a world I never knew existed. He watched her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. A world of power and betrayal, he said, his voice low. A world where loyalty is everything and betrayal is a death sentence. The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of her own precarious situation. She was an outsider, a pawn in this world of ancient feuds and hidden alliances. But she was also beginning to understand it, to see the complexities and the contradictions that lay beneath the surface. The weight she carried, the one she had carried since her father's betrayal, was now shared, not equally, but in a way that made her feel less alone. And she started to suspect his was far heavier. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Lost Life. The more time Alessandra spent within the walls of the Benedetti mansion, the more she felt the presence of the past. It wasn't just the ancient portraits on the walls, the antique furniture, or the yellowed documents in the library. It was something deeper, a sense of lives lived, of loves and losses, of triumphs and tragedies that echoed through the halls. She began to piece together fragments of the Benedetti family history, gleaned from her explorations of the library, her conversations with the servants who, despite their initial reticence, were slowly warming to her quiet kindness, and her increasingly frequent interactions with Dario. She learned of his grandfather, a legendary capo who had built the family empire from nothing, a man of ruthless ambition and unwavering loyalty. She learned of his father, a weaker man, who had struggled to maintain his father's legacy, a man haunted by his own failures. And she learned of Isabella, Dario's mother, a woman of great beauty and spirit, who had died young, leaving a void in Dario's life that had never been filled. The portrait of Isabella hung in the grand hallway, a striking image of a woman with dark, fiery eyes and a smile that hinted at a rebellious spirit. Alessandra found herself drawn to the portrait, sensing a kinship with this woman she had never met. She saw in Isabella's eyes a reflection of her own longing for freedom, her own defiance against the constraints of her world. One evening, she found Dario standing in front of the portrait, his expression somber. He didn't seem to notice her presence, lost in his own thoughts. She was beautiful, Alessandra said softly, her voice breaking the silence. He turned, startled, his eyes focusing on her. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She was everything. The raw grief in his voice surprised her. She had seen glimpses of his vulnerability before, but this was different. This was the pain of a son who had lost his mother too soon, a wound that had never fully healed. What happened to her? She asked, her voice hesitant. He hesitated, his gaze returning to the portrait. She was killed, he said, his voice flat. Caught in the crossfire of a rival family's attack. The words were brutal, stark. Alessandra could only imagine the impact of such a loss on a young boy. It explained the darkness that clung to him, the guardedness, the fear of vulnerability. I'm sorry, she said, the words inadequate but heartfelt. He nodded, his expression closing off again. It was a long time ago, he said. But she knew it wasn't. The past was always present, shaping the present, casting a long shadow over the future. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, in the choices he made. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but she knew she couldn't. The walls between them were still too high, the chasm of their circumstances too wide. "Tell me about her," she said instead, her voice gentle. He looked at her, surprised. He hesitated, then, to her surprise, he began to speak. He told her stories of Isabella, of her kindness, her strength, her love of life. He spoke of her laughter, her passion for music, her unwavering loyalty to her family. As he spoke, his expression softened, the lines of tension on his face easing. He seemed to lose himself in the memories, momentarily forgetting the weight of his responsibilities, the darkness of his world. Alessandra listened, captivated, feeling a connection to this woman she had never met, a connection that transcended time and circumstance. She saw in Isabella a reflection of her own mother, a woman who had also been taken too soon, a woman whose memory she cherished. The conversation, unexpected and intimate, marked another shift in their relationship. It was a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their differences, a shared understanding of loss and grief. The past was always there. She saw it in every shadow, every portrait, and in his face. But in sharing his memories, he had offered her a key, a way to understand not only his family's history, but the very core of the man who held her captive. It was a dangerous knowledge, but one that she felt compelled to pursue. Because she knew, without a doubt, that to unravel him, it was paramount to understand the love he lost. Chapter 6. Scars Beneath the Surface. The shared intimacy of the conversation about Isabella had opened a door, however slightly. Dario, while still maintaining his guarded demeanor, seemed more willing to engage with Alessandra, to share fragments of his thoughts and feelings. He wasn't confiding in her, not exactly, but he was allowing her glimpses beneath the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. Alessandra, in turn, found herself increasingly drawn to him, fascinated by the complexities of his character. She saw the ruthlessness, the cold calculation that were necessary for his position, but she also saw the flashes of vulnerability, the moments of unexpected kindness, the deep-seated loneliness that he tried so hard to conceal. One afternoon, she found him in his study, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms marked with several intricate tattoos. He was working at his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said, her voice apologetic. He sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"It's fine," he said.
"What is it?" She hesitated, then gestured towards his arms. "Your tattoos," she said. "They're intriguing." He glanced down at his arms, as if noticing them for the first time. "They are a history," he said, his voice noncommittal. She approached the desk, her eyes drawn to the intricate designs. She recognized some of the symbols: the Benedetti family crest, a coiled serpent, a stylized dagger. Others were more obscure, a language she didn't understand. "Can you tell me about them?" she asked, her voice curious. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Each one represents a significant event," he said. "A battle won, a debt repaid, a life taken." The words were chilling, a stark reminder of the violent world he inhabited. But she also sensed a deeper meaning, a personal significance that he wasn't revealing. She pointed to a particular tattoo, a small, intricate design of a rose with thorns. "This one," she said. "What does it mean?" He looked at the rose, his expression softening slightly. "It represents a loss," he said, his voice low. She knew he wasn't talking about Isabella. This was something different, something more recent, something that still haunted him. "Someone you loved?" she asked, her voice gentle. He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the tattoo. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. She could see the pain in his eyes, the raw grief that he tried so hard to suppress. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his skin, a light, fleeting touch. He flinched, as if surprised by her contact, but he didn't pull away. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It leaves a scar that never fully heals. He looked at her, his eyes searching, questioning. He seemed to be searching for something in her face, some sign of understanding, some connection. You are full of surprises, Alessandra, he said, his voice soft. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. So are you, Dario, she said. The moment hung between them, fragile and intense. It was a recognition of their shared humanity, a glimpse of the scars that lay beneath the surface, the wounds that had shaped them both. He broke the gaze first, turning away, his expression closing off again. I have work to do, he said, his voice dismissive. She nodded, understanding. She had pushed him as far as he was willing to go for now. She turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. Dario, she said, her voice soft. The scars, they don't define us. They are just a part of who we are. He didn't answer, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, acknowledgement, perhaps, or even a glimmer of hope. He had revealed a part of himself he generally kept deeply hidden. This secret language written on his skin opened up a new facet of his story. She was starting to assemble the puzzle, and, with it, an unexpected empathy for him. Chapter 7. The Dance of Power and Submission. The unspoken understanding that had blossomed between them, born from shared grief and acknowledged vulnerability, didn't erase the fundamental power dynamic that defined their relationship. Dario was still the capo, the master of his domain, and Alessandra was still his captive, her freedom contingent on his whim. But the nature of their interactions had subtly shifted. The constant, overt displays of dominance that had characterized their early encounters were less frequent, replaced by a more nuanced dance of power and submission, a delicate balance between control and defiance. Dario still gave orders, but he often framed them as requests, his voice softening, his eyes holding a hint of something that wasn't quite apology, but perhaps a recognition of her dignity. He still controlled her movements, her access to the outside world, but he allowed her more freedom within the confines of his estate, trusting her, to a degree, not to attempt escape. Alessandra, in turn, continued to walk the tightrope between obedience and resistance. She complied with his requests, outwardly accepting her role as the Signora Benedetti, but she never completely surrendered. She maintained a quiet defiance, a refusal to be broken, a subtle assertion of her own will. She used her intelligence, her observations, her growing understanding of Dario and his world, to navigate the treacherous currents of their relationship. She learned to read his moods, to anticipate his reactions, to subtly influence his decisions. One evening, he summoned her to his study. He was standing by the window, gazing out at the darkening landscape, his expression troubled. There is a situation, he said, his voice low. A rival famiglia is making moves. They are testing our boundaries. She knew what that meant. Violence, bloodshed, a threat to the delicate balance of power that maintained the fragile peace within the underworld. What will you do? She asked, her voice calm. He turned, his eyes searching hers. I will do what I must, he said. Protect what is mine. She saw the cold determination in his eyes, the ruthlessness that was a necessary part of his world. But she also saw the weariness, the burden of leadership that weighed him down. There may be another way, she said, her voice hesitant. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. And what would that be? He asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She was stepping into dangerous territory, challenging his authority, offering an unsolicited opinion. But she felt compelled to speak, to try to find a solution that didn't involve bloodshed. Negotiation, she said. A meeting. A chance to find common ground. He laughed, a short, bitter laugh. You are naive, Alessandra, he said. These are not men who understand reason. They only understand force. Perhaps, she said. But what if you could offer them something they want? Something that would make violence unnecessary? He studied her for a long moment, his eyes assessing. He was considering her suggestion, weighing the risks and the potential benefits. And what would that be? He asked finally. She hesitated, then took the plunge. Information, she said. I have been studying the family records. I have discovered certain weaknesses in their operations, certain vulnerabilities that you could exploit. He was surprised. She could see it in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to delve so deeply into his world, to understand the intricacies of his business. You have been busy, he said, his voice noncommittal.
I have, she said.
And I believe I can help you. He considered her offer, the silence stretching between them. She knew she was taking a risk, revealing her knowledge, her understanding. But she also knew that it was her only chance to influence him, to steer him away from a path of violence. Finally, he nodded. Show me, he said. She spent the next hour outlining her findings, pointing out the weaknesses in the rival family's operations, suggesting strategies for negotiation. He listened intently, asking questions, challenging her assumptions, testing her knowledge. By the time she was finished, he was impressed. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he looked at her. He had underestimated her, and she had proven him wrong. You have a sharp mind, Alessandra, he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. A valuable asset. The compliment, so unexpected, so different from his usual guardedness, warmed her. She had earned his respect, not through submission, but through her own intelligence and initiative. He was still the capo, and she was still his captive. But the balance of power had shifted, however slightly. She had proven her worth, not as a possession, but as a partner, a strategist, a force to be reckoned with. It was a dangerous game, but it gave her hope to continue the dance. She knew she was useful, and with that a small light was ignited, promising her freedom in the distance. Chapter 8. A crack in the armor. Alessandra's successful intervention in the brewing conflict with their rival famiglia had earned her a new level of respect from Dario. He began to treat her less like a captive and more like a confidant, seeking her counsel on matters of business, sharing his concerns and his frustrations. It was a dangerous position to be in, privy to the secrets of his world, caught between loyalty and self-preservation. But she embraced the opportunity, using her intelligence and her growing understanding of the famiglia dynamics to navigate the treacherous currents of their relationship. She knew that Dario was still a dangerous man, capable of ruthless violence, but she also saw the cracks in his armor, the vulnerabilities that he tried so hard to conceal. She saw the loneliness that haunted him, the weight of responsibility that he carried, the yearning for something more than the power and control that defined his life. One evening, he found her in the library, reading by the fire. He stood in the doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable. You seem to find solace in books, he said, his voice soft. She looked up, surprised by his presence.
They offer an escape, she said.
A world beyond these walls. He nodded, understanding. I understand the need for escape, he said. He approached the fireplace, his gaze drawn to the flames. He seemed lost in thought, his expression troubled. What is it? She asked, her voice gentle. He hesitated, then sighed.
There is a problem, he said.
A betrayal.
She knew what that meant.
In his world, betrayal was a death sentence. It was a constant threat, a shadow that lurked in every corner. Who? She asked, her voice low. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense.
Someone I trusted, he said. Someone close to me.
The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. She saw the pain in his eyes, the raw wound of betrayal. It was a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. I'm sorry, she said, the words inadequate but heartfelt. He nodded, his gaze returning to the fire.
It is a reminder, he said.
A reminder that trust is a luxury I cannot afford. She understood. In his world, trust was a weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited. He had built walls around himself, protecting himself from the pain of betrayal, the disappointment of human connection. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but she knew she couldn't. The walls were too high, the chasm of their circumstances too wide. Not all trust is misplaced, she said softly. He looked at her, surprised. You think so? He asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. I do, she said. I trust you. The words were reckless, dangerous, but she meant them. She had come to trust him, Not blindly, not naively, but with a clear understanding of the risks. She trusted his intelligence, his strength, his integrity, however flawed. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching, questioning. He seemed to be searching for something in her face, some sign of deception, some ulterior motive.
Why?
He asked finally.
Because I see you, she said.
Not just the capo, but the man beneath the armor. He laughed, a short, bitter laugh that held no mirth.
You see too much, Alessandra, he said. Perhaps, she said.
But what I see is worth trusting. The moment hung between them, fragile and intense. It was a confession, a declaration of faith, a bridge built across the chasm of their differences. He broke the gaze first, turning away, his expression closing off again. Trust is a dangerous game, Alessandra, he said. One you may regret playing. He hesitated, then added, more softly, but I've been proven wrong before. He was still guarded, still wary, but she had planted a seed of trust that might, just might, blossom into something more. She saw the betrayal was fresh and deep, and that, she realized, was a crucial part of the man, more significant than she previously imagined. The trust had been broken by someone he held close, and she knew exactly how to use it to her advantage. Chapter 9. The Serpent's Kiss. The betrayal Dario had spoken of cast a long shadow over the Benedetti household. The atmosphere was thick with tension, suspicion lurking in every corner, whispers echoing through the halls. Dario, usually so controlled, so impassive, was visibly shaken, his anger simmering beneath the surface, his trust shattered. Alessandra, despite her own precarious position, found herself drawn into the vortex of the crisis. Dario, increasingly reliant on her counsel, confided in her, sharing details of the betrayal, seeking her insights, her perspective. She learned that the traitor was Marco, Dario's cousin and most trusted lieutenant, a man who had been like a brother to him. Marco had been secretly colluding with a rival famiglia, siphoning funds, leaking information, plotting to overthrow Dario and seize control of the Benedetti empire. The revelation was a devastating blow to Dario, a betrayal of the deepest kind. He had trusted Marco implicitly, had shared his secrets, his vulnerabilities, his fears. And Marco had used that trust against him, twisting the knife with cold, calculated precision. Alessandra saw the pain in Dario's eyes, the raw wound of betrayal. She understood the depth of his anger, his need for revenge. But she also saw the danger, the potential for the situation to spiral out of control, to lead to a bloody war that would consume them all. You must be careful, Dario, she said, her voice low. Revenge is a dish best served cold. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. You think I should let him get away with this? He asked, his voice laced with bitterness.
No, she said.
But you must be strategic. You must think before you act.
He scoffed.
Sentiment has no place in this world, Alessandra, he reminded her, his voice hard. I'm not suggesting sentiment, Dario, she responded, matching his intensity. I'm suggesting strategy. A calculated response is more effective than blind rage. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes assessing. She knew he was weighing her words, considering her advice. He respected her intelligence, her sharp mind, but he was also a man accustomed to acting decisively, to using force to resolve his problems. What do you suggest? He asked finally. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She was stepping into dangerous territory, offering advice on matters that could have life or death consequences. But she felt compelled to speak, to try to guide him towards a path that wouldn't lead to further bloodshed. Gather evidence, she said. Build an irrefutable case. Expose him publicly, to the other families. Let them see his treachery, his betrayal. And then? He asked, his voice challenging. Then let justice take its course, she said. Let the famiglia decide his fate. He laughed, a short, bitter laugh. You are naive, Alessandra, he said. Justice in our world is swift and brutal. Perhaps, she said. But it is also necessary. To maintain order, to prevent chaos. He considered her words, the silence stretching between them. She knew she was walking a tightrope, trying to balance his need for revenge with her own desire for a less violent solution. Finally, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "We will do it your way.
For now."
He began to gather evidence, working with a small, trusted circle of advisors, meticulously documenting Marco's treachery. Alessandra assisted him, using her knowledge of the family records, her understanding of the famiglia dynamics, to build a case that was irrefutable. As they worked together, the bond between them deepened. They were partners in this endeavor, united by a shared purpose, a shared goal. But the danger was always present, the threat of exposure, the knowledge that one wrong move could have devastating consequences. One evening, as they were working late in the study, Dario paused, his gaze fixed on her. "You are risking a great deal for me, Alessandra," he said, his voice low. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I believe in you, Dario," she said. "I believe in what we are trying to do." He smiled, a slow, sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You are a foolish woman," he said, "but a brave one." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And perhaps the only one I can truly trust." The words, so unexpected, so intimate, sent a shiver down her spine. She could feel the heat of his breath on her skin, the pull of something dangerous and alluring. It was a moment of vulnerability, a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the capo. It felt, too, like she was now in more danger than when she had first arrived, because she was starting to fall for the serpent. And she feared his kiss above all. Chapter 10. Unveiling the Past. The carefully constructed case against Marco was complete. Dario, guided by Alessandra's strategic counsel, had gathered irrefutable evidence of his cousin's treachery, bank records, intercepted communications, witness testimonies. He had exposed Marco's betrayal to the heads of the other families, presenting the evidence in a closed-door meeting, a council of judgment. The outcome was swift and brutal, as Alessandra had predicted. Marco, stripped of his rank, his power, his honor, was banished from the famiglia, his life spared only by a narrow margin, a concession to his former status and Dario's lingering, though deeply wounded, sense of family loyalty. The resolution of the crisis, while satisfying in its exposure of treachery, left a lingering unease within Alessandra. She had seen the darkness of Dario's world, the ruthlessness with which justice was meted out, the constant threat of violence that hung in the air. She had also seen the toll it had taken on Dario. He had emerged victorious, his power reinforced, his enemies subdued. But he was also weary, his spirit burdened by the betrayal, the constant vigilance, the weight of his responsibilities. One evening, she found him in the gardens, standing by the overgrown rose garden, his gaze fixed on the faded blooms. He seemed lost in thought, his expression somber. "It is done," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. He turned, startled, his eyes focusing on her. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "It is done." He didn't seem relieved or triumphant. He seemed empty. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He shrugged, his gaze returning to the roses. "As all right as I can be," he said. She approached him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, a gesture of comfort. He didn't flinch away, but he didn't respond either. "It's a heavy burden, isn't it?" she said, her voice low. The power, the responsibility, the constant threat. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I do," she said. "More than you know." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. She sensed a deep loneliness in him, a yearning for something more than the world he inhabited, a world of violence and betrayal. "Tell me about your father," she said, her voice gentle. He hesitated, surprised by her question. He had spoken of his mother, of Isabella, but rarely of his father. "He was a difficult man," he said finally. "Strong, ambitious, but cold." "Did you love him?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He looked away, his expression clouded. "I respected him," he said. "I feared him. But love, that is a complicated word." She understood. He had grown up in a world where love was a weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited. He had learned to suppress his emotions, to build walls around his heart, to protect himself from the pain of loss. "It doesn't have to be complicated," she said softly. "Love can be a strength, a source of comfort, a reason to fight." He looked at her, his eyes questioning. "You believe that?" he asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "I do," she said.
"I have seen it."
"In my own life, in the lives of others." He was silent for a long moment, considering her words. She knew she was challenging his worldview, his deeply ingrained beliefs about power, about love, about life. "My father, he made mistakes," he said finally, his voice low. "He allowed his ambition to cloud his judgment. He made enemies, he alienated allies, he lost his way." She sensed a deep-seated regret in his voice, a recognition of his father's flaws, his failures. "And you are trying to be different?" she asked, her voice gentle. He nodded. "I am trying," he said. "But it is not easy. The past, it casts a long shadow." He was right. The past was always present, shaping the present, influencing the future. But she also believed that it didn't have to define them. They could learn from the past, they could choose a different path, they could break free from the cycle of violence and betrayal. The unraveling of Marco's betrayal had been a catalyst, revealing not only the darkness of Dario's world, but also the complexities of his character, his hidden vulnerabilities, his yearning for something more. It had brought them closer, forged a bond of trust and understanding. But it remained a fragile connection. The key to his freedom lay in finding the rest of the story, the one he kept hidden, the one that fueled his every move. Chapter 11. Threads of Loyalty and Deceit. With Marco's banishment, a tense calm settled over the Benedetti estate. Yet, beneath the surface, currents of uncertainty and suspicion lingered. Dario, though outwardly composed, remained vigilant, aware that the roots of betrayal could run deep and that other hidden enemies might still lurk within his ranks. Alessandra, now privy to many of Dario's concerns and strategies, found herself increasingly entangled in the intricate web of famiglia politics. She used her position, her access to information, and her growing influence over Dario to navigate the treacherous landscape, seeking to solidify her own safety while also subtly guiding Dario towards a less volatile path. One day, while reviewing some old ledgers in the library a task Dario had surprisingly entrusted to her, Alessandra stumbled upon a discrepancy, a series of unusual transactions that didn't quite add up. The entries were coded, obscured, but her sharp mind, honed by her previous investigations, quickly deciphered the hidden meaning. The transactions pointed to a secret alliance, a clandestine partnership between Marco and another, unexpected figure within the Benedetti famiglia, Antonio, Dario's seemingly loyal and unassuming uncle, the brother of his late father. The discovery sent a chill down Alessandra's spine. Antonio had always presented himself as a harmless, almost irrelevant figure, a man content with his minor role within the family, offering avuncular advice and support. But the ledgers told a different story, a story of hidden ambition, of carefully concealed treachery. She knew she had to tell Dario, but she also knew that the revelation would be another devastating blow, shattering his already fragile trust, potentially pushing him towards a more ruthless, more violent response. She waited until evening, when the household was quiet, and sought him out in his study. He was standing by the window, gazing out at the darkened landscape, his expression troubled. "Dario," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "I need to talk to you." He turned, his eyes searching hers. "What is it?" he asked, his voice wary. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I have found something," she said. "Something disturbing." She explained her discovery, showing him the entries in the ledgers, deciphering the coded messages, outlining the evidence of Antonio's involvement with Marco. He listened in silence, his expression hardening with each revelation, his eyes darkening with anger. She saw the familiar signs of his rage building, the cold, calculating fury that she had witnessed before. "Antonio," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My own uncle." The words were laced with disbelief, with pain, with a sense of profound betrayal. It was another blow to his trust, another crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed. "I'm sorry, Dario," she said, her voice gentle. "I know this is difficult." He turned away, his fists clenched, his body trembling with suppressed rage. "He will pay for this," he said, his voice low and dangerous.
She knew what that meant.
Violence, bloodshed, a swift and brutal retribution. It was the way of his world, the code he lived by. But she also knew that it wasn't the only way. There was another path, a path of strategy, of calculated action, a path that could minimize the damage, prevent further chaos. "Dario," she said, her voice firm.
"Wait. Think."
He turned back to her, his eyes blazing. "Think?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "What is there to think about?" "He betrayed me. He betrayed the Famiglia." "I know," she said. "But acting impulsively will only make things worse. You need a plan, a strategy."
He scoffed. "I have a plan," he said.
"It involves a bullet and his head." She took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. "There is another way, Dario," she said, her voice pleading. "A way that doesn't involve more bloodshed, more violence." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He was struggling, torn between his need for revenge and his growing trust in her judgment. "What do you suggest?" he asked finally, his voice grudging. The unearthing of the past had begun. She saw, for the first time, that his own family was the core of his deepest pain. And she had to act carefully or risk everything. Chapter 12. The Taste of Freedom. Alessandra's suggestion, as always, was rooted in strategy and a careful understanding of the Famiglia dynamics. She proposed a plan that was both bold and subtle, a way to expose Antonio's treachery without resorting to immediate violence, a way to minimize the damage and maintain a semblance of stability within the fractured family. "We need to gather more evidence," she said. "Irrefutable proof, not just of his alliance with Marco, but of his own ambitions, his own plans to undermine you." Dario, still simmering with anger, was initially resistant. He wanted swift retribution, a decisive blow to eliminate the threat. But Alessandra's calm, reasoned arguments, her unwavering focus on a strategic approach, gradually swayed him. "We need to use his own methods against him," she continued. "Set a trap, expose him in a way that leaves no room for doubt, no possibility of denial." The plan involved a carefully orchestrated series of events, a delicate dance of deception and manipulation. Alessandra, using her access to the family records and her growing knowledge of their operations, identified a potential vulnerability in Antonio's illicit dealings, a secret project he was undertaking that could be used to expose his treachery. They worked together, meticulously planning each step, anticipating potential obstacles, preparing for every contingency. Dario, despite his initial reluctance, was impressed by Alessandra's sharp mind, her strategic thinking, her ability to see the bigger picture. The execution of the plan was tense and fraught with danger. They had to move carefully, secretly, avoiding detection by Antonio's loyalists, ensuring that their actions remained hidden until the opportune moment. Alessandra, playing her part with a mixture of courage and cunning, managed to gather the necessary evidence, exposing Antonio's secret project to a select group of influential Famiglia members, revealing his treachery in a way that was both undeniable and humiliating. The fallout was swift and decisive. Antonio, stripped of his power, his influence, his credibility, was ostracized, banished from the Famiglia, his fate sealed by his own actions. Dario, though initially thirsting for a more violent retribution, was ultimately satisfied with the outcome. He had eliminated the threat, maintained his position, and avoided a potentially bloody internal conflict. And he had done it with Alessandra's help, relying on her intelligence, her strategic thinking, her unwavering support. One evening, after the dust had settled, he found her in the gardens, standing by the fountain, gazing at the moonlit water. "You were right," he said, his voice soft. "There was another way." She turned, smiling, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I know," she said. He approached her, his gaze lingering on hers.
You have changed things, he said.
You have changed me. The words were unexpected, heartfelt. She saw a vulnerability in his eyes, a softening of his demeanor, a recognition of her influence on him. I have only shown you what was already there, she said. The capacity for something other than violence, other than revenge. He nodded, his gaze returning to the fountain. I have been blind, he said. Blind to the possibilities, blind to the cost. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. She sensed a shift in him, a willingness to reconsider his ways, to embrace a different path. Alessandra, he said, his voice low and hesitant. I want to offer you something. She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming, the offer she had been longing for, the possibility she had dared to dream of. Your freedom, he said. You have earned it. The words hung in the air, shimmering like the moonlight on the water. She had tasted it, that freedom, in small increments, in the growing trust, in the shared strategies, in the moments of vulnerability. But this was different. She looked at him and saw it was genuine. And that freedom held more than just going back home. It offered the choice, to stay or to go. And for the first time, the decision wasn't as easy as she imagined. Chapter 13. Shadows of the Past. The offer of freedom hung between them, a shimmering possibility, a life-altering decision. Alessandra, who had yearned for this moment since her captivity began, found herself surprisingly hesitant, torn between the desire to return to her former life and the unexpected connection she had forged with Dario, with this world, with this man. She had earned her freedom, yes, but she had also gained something else, a sense of purpose, a feeling of belonging, a connection to a world that was both dangerous and alluring. She had found strength she didn't know she possessed, a resilience that had blossomed in the face of adversity. Thank you, Dario, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I need time to think. He nodded, understanding. He didn't press her, didn't try to influence her decision. He simply offered her the space, the time she needed to make her choice. She spent the following days in a state of quiet contemplation, weighing her options, examining her feelings, trying to make sense of the complex emotions that swirled within her. She walked the familiar paths of the estate, the gardens, the library, the music room, each place holding memories, echoes of the experiences that had shaped her, transformed her. She saw the beauty and the darkness, the opulence and the violence, the loyalty and the betrayal. She thought of her father, of his shame, his weakness, his betrayal. She thought of her former life, the comfortable, predictable existence that had been shattered by her captivity. She thought of the friends, the family, the familiar routines that she had left behind. But she also thought of Dario, of his complexities, his vulnerabilities, his hidden depths. She thought of the moments of connection they had shared, the trust they had built, the challenges they had overcome together. One evening, she found him in his study, poring over old family documents. He looked up as she entered, his expression questioning. Have you made a decision? He asked, his voice neutral. She shook her head. Not yet, she said. But I need to understand something. What is it? He asked. Your past, she said. The real past. Not just the stories, the legends, but the truth. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away. He was reluctant, she knew, to reveal his vulnerabilities, to expose the wounds that had shaped him. Why? He asked, his voice guarded. Because I need to understand you, she said. To understand why you are the way you are. He was silent for a long moment, considering her request. She knew she was asking a great deal, demanding access to the deepest recesses of his heart, his soul. Finally, he nodded. Very well, he said. But it is not a pretty story. He began to speak, his voice low and hesitant, revealing the details of his past, the traumas that had shaped him, the experiences that had hardened him. He spoke of his mother's death, of the violence that had claimed her life, of the impact it had had on him as a young boy. He spoke of his father's coldness, his distance, his inability to offer comfort, to show love. He spoke of the pressures of his inheritance, the weight of responsibility that had been thrust upon him at a young age, the expectations he had struggled to meet. He spoke of a woman he had loved, a woman who had betrayed him, a woman who had used his trust to further her own ambitions, a woman who had left him scarred and broken. As he spoke, Alessandra saw the pain in his eyes, the raw wounds that had never fully healed. She understood the darkness that clung to him, the guardedness, the fear of vulnerability. She also saw the strength, the resilience, the determination to overcome his past, to forge a different path. She saw the man beneath the capo, the human being with his own flaws, his own vulnerabilities, his own yearning for connection. The story, while heartbreaking, filled in the missing pieces, the gaps in her understanding of Dario. It explained his actions, his motivations, his fears. It also deepened her empathy, her connection to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for sharing that with me." He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers.
"It is the past," he said.
"It does not define me."
"No," she said.
"But it helps me understand you." The shadows were still there, the echoes of the past, but they were no longer so daunting, so overwhelming. She had seen the darkness, and she had also seen the light, the possibility of redemption, of healing, of change. The story, his story, was more connected to the present than she realized, and it was a story intrinsically linked to her father. The name was not mentioned yet, but the seed was planted. And with it, the choice she had to make was no longer about freedom. It was about choosing a future. Chapter 14. The Heart's Rebellion. The revelation of Dario's past, the raw vulnerability he had exposed, had created a profound shift in their relationship. The walls between them, though still present, were crumbling, replaced by a fragile intimacy, a shared understanding that transcended their circumstances. Alessandra, having gained a deeper understanding of Dario's complexities, his wounds, his hidden depths, found herself increasingly drawn to him, her feelings evolving from a mixture of fear and fascination to something more profound, something that resembled love. It was a dangerous emotion, a forbidden desire, a rebellion of the heart against the constraints of her situation. She was still, technically, his captive, her freedom offered but not yet claimed. And he was still the capo, a man of power and violence, a man who lived by a code that was often brutal and unforgiving. But she couldn't deny the connection she felt, the pull of her heart towards his, the yearning for a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. She began to spend more time with him, seeking out his company, engaging in conversations that went beyond the strategic, the political, the practical. They talked about their hopes, their dreams, their fears, sharing fragments of their inner selves, building a bridge across the chasm of their differences. One evening, as they were walking through the gardens, the scent of roses heavy in the air, he stopped and turned to her, his gaze intense. "Alessandra," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I have been thinking." She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming, the question that hung between them, the decision she had been avoiding. "About your offer," he continued. "Your freedom." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I don't want you to go," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The words, so unexpected, so heartfelt, sent a wave of emotion through her. She had longed for freedom, yes, but she had also longed for this, for him, for the connection they had forged, for the possibility of a future together. "Dario," she said, her voice trembling. She couldn't speak, the words caught in her throat. She was torn, conflicted, her heart and her mind at war. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the contours of her face. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, savoring the moment, the intimacy, the connection. "I know it's complicated," he said, his voice soft. "But I care for you, Alessandra. More than I thought possible." The confession, so raw, so vulnerable, shattered the last remnants of her resistance. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, her heart overflowing with emotion. "I care for you too, Dario," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "More than I ever thought possible." He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning kiss. She responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, drawing him closer, deepening the kiss, pouring all her emotions, her fears, her hopes, her love into the embrace. It was a moment of surrender, a moment of acceptance, a moment of rebellion. She was choosing him, choosing this life, choosing this dangerous, alluring, impossible love. The decision, once made, brought a sense of peace, a sense of certainty, a sense of rightness. She knew the challenges that lay ahead, the obstacles they would face, the dangers they would encounter. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had him, and he had her, and together, they would face whatever the future held. The kiss was the moment she had to choose a side. And, by returning it, Dario also unknowingly had to choose. His past was about to become a great obstacle, and it was one that involved Alessandra more than she could imagine. Chapter 15. A pact forged in fire. The kiss, that first, tentative embrace, had sealed their fate, forging a pact between them, a commitment to a future that was both uncertain and exhilarating. Alessandra, having made the decision to stay, to embrace this dangerous, alluring love, threw herself into this new reality with a fierce determination. She was no longer a captive, but a partner, a confidant, a lover. She had earned Dario's trust, his respect, his affection, and she was determined to prove herself worthy of his love, to navigate this treacherous world alongside him, to build a future together, despite the odds. Dario, in turn, was transformed by Alessandra's love, his hardened heart softened, his guarded demeanor relaxed, his outlook on life subtly but profoundly altered. He had found in her a connection he had never thought possible, a love that transcended the boundaries of his world, a hope for a future that was brighter, more fulfilling, more human. He began to involve her more deeply in the affairs of the famiglia, sharing his plans, his strategies, his concerns. He sought her counsel, valued her insights, trusted her judgment. He treated her as an equal, a partner in every sense of the word. One evening, he summoned her to his study, his expression serious. "Alessandra," he said, his voice low, "there is something I need to tell you.
Something about my past.
Something that involves your father." The words sent a chill down her spine. She had known, instinctively, that their pasts were intertwined, that there was a connection, a hidden link that had yet to be revealed. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away. He was reluctant, she knew, to expose this vulnerability, to reveal this truth that could potentially shatter their fragile bond. "Tell me," she said, her voice firm. "I need to know." He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "Your father, he was not just a gambler, a debtor," he said. "He was a traitor. He betrayed my father, many years ago. He was involved in the events that led to my mother's death." The revelation was a blow, a shock to her system. She had known her father was flawed, weak, but she had never imagined him capable of such treachery, of such profound betrayal. What happened? She asked, her voice trembling. He recounted the story, his voice filled with pain, with anger, with a lingering sense of grief. He told her how Lorenzo, driven by ambition and greed, had colluded with a rival famiglia, providing them with information that had led to an attack on the Benedetti estate, an attack that had resulted in Isabella's death. "My father, he spared his life," Dario continued. "He banished him, exiled him, but he did not kill him. He showed him mercy." The mercy, Alessandra realized, had been a mistake. Lorenzo, consumed by shame and resentment, had continued to plot against the Benedettis, seeking revenge, fueling the cycle of violence and betrayal. "And now you are here," Dario said, his voice soft. "The daughter of the man who betrayed my family." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his love for her and the lingering pain of the past. "I am not my father," she said, her voice firm. "I am not responsible for his actions." He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers. "I know," he said, "but the past, it has a way of catching up with us." She understood. Their love, their future, was threatened by the shadows of the past, by the legacy of betrayal that hung between them. "We will face it together," she said, her voice determined. "We will not let the past destroy us." He smiled, a slow, sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You are a brave woman, Alessandra," he said. "And I love you." The words, so heartfelt, so sincere, reaffirmed their commitment, their pact, their determination to build a future together, despite the obstacles, despite the shadows, despite the past. The alliance, however, was about to be tested, and the consequences would either make or break their union forever. Because for Dario, family meant everything, and Alessandra was now about to test his definition. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm. The revelation of Lorenzo's treachery, his involvement in Isabella's death, had cast a long shadow over their newfound love, creating a tension that was both unspoken and palpable. Dario, though deeply in love with Alessandra, struggled to reconcile his feelings for her with the legacy of betrayal that her father represented. Alessandra, in turn, felt the weight of her father's actions, the burden of his sins, the threat they posed to her future with Dario. She was determined to prove her loyalty, her love, her commitment to him, to show him that she was not her father, that she was worthy of his trust. But the past, as Dario had warned, had a way of catching up with them. The enemies of the Benedetti famiglia, sensing an opportunity to exploit the rift, began to stir, whispering rumors, spreading dissent, plotting to undermine Dario's power, to take advantage of his perceived weakness. One evening, Dario summoned Alessandra to his study, his expression grim. "There is trouble," he said, his voice low. "The other families, they are growing restless. They sense vulnerability."
She knew what that meant.
A challenge to his authority, a threat to their stability, a potential for violence. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice calm, despite the turmoil within her. He explained the situation, outlining the complex web of alliances and rivalries that define the underworld, the delicate balance of power that was now threatened by her father's legacy. "They believe I am weakened," he said, "by my attachment to you. They see you as a liability." The words stung, a painful reminder of the obstacles they faced, the prejudice she encountered, the suspicion that surrounded her. "I will not be a liability, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "I will prove them wrong." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the determination in her gaze, the strength of her spirit, the unwavering loyalty she offered. "I know you will," he said, his voice soft. They began to work together, strategizing, planning, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Alessandra, using her knowledge of the famiglia dynamics, her understanding of their enemies, her sharp mind, offered valuable insights, helping Dario to anticipate their moves, to counter their threats. She also reached out to her own contacts, the few allies she had within the underworld, seeking to gather information, to build support, to strengthen their position. One evening, as they were working late in the study, a coded message arrived, a warning from one of Alessandra's contacts. "They are planning an attack," she said, her voice urgent. "On the estate. Tonight." Dario's expression hardened, his eyes darkening with anger. "Let them come," he said, his voice cold and determined. "We will be ready." They mobilized their forces, preparing for the assault, fortifying the estate, arming their men. Alessandra, refusing to be sidelined, insisted on staying by Dario's side, her presence a symbol of their unity, their defiance. As darkness fell, the storm broke. The rival families, emboldened by their perceived advantage, launched a full-scale attack on the Benedetti estate, a violent assault aimed at overthrowing Dario and seizing control of his empire. The night was filled with the sounds of gunfire, the shouts of men, the clash of steel. The estate, once a haven of peace and tranquility, became a battleground, a scene of chaos and destruction. Dario, leading his men with courage and determination, fought fiercely, defending his home, his family, his love. Alessandra, armed and ready, stood by his side, her presence a source of strength, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The battle raged throughout the night, a brutal, bloody confrontation that tested their strength, their loyalty, their love. But they stood together, united against their enemies, determined to survive, to prevail, to protect their future. They had a pact, a dangerous one, but one that made them stronger than their individual powers. The storm was upon them, but it wasn't just the rivals that were gathering. It was also their will to fight. Chapter 17. Blood and Tears. The attack on the Benedetti estate was a brutal, chaotic affair, a maelstrom of violence and destruction that tested the limits of their strength and resilience. Dario, leading his men with a fierce determination, fought with a cold, calculated fury, his movements precise, his actions decisive. Alessandra, despite her lack of combat experience, proved to be a valuable asset, her sharp mind working tirelessly, anticipating enemy movements, relaying information, providing support where needed. She refused to cower, to hide, to be a passive observer. She was a warrior, fighting alongside her love, defending their home, their future. The battle raged throughout the night, the grounds of the estate littered with the bodies of the fallen, the air thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder. The mansion itself, once a symbol of opulence and power, was scarred and damaged, its windows shattered, its walls riddled with bullet holes. Alessandra, moving through the chaos with a surprising agility, found herself face to face with one of the attackers, a young man, barely older than herself, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. He lunged at her with a knife, his movements clumsy, untrained. She reacted instinctively, dodging his attack, using her own weapon, a small pistol Dario had insisted she carry, to defend herself. The shot rang out, echoing through the night, and the young man fell, his body crumpling to the ground. It was the first time she had taken a life, a moment that would forever be etched in her memory. The weight of it settled upon her, a heavy burden of guilt and sorrow. But there was no time for remorse, no time for reflection. The battle continued, and she had to keep fighting, to survive, to protect Dario. As the night wore on, the tide of the battle began to turn. Dario's men, better trained, better equipped, and fiercely loyal, gradually gained the upper hand, pushing back the attackers, forcing them to retreat. But the victory came at a cost. Many of Dario's men were wounded, some fatally. And Dario himself, despite his strength and resilience, had not escaped unscathed. Alessandra found him near the fountain, his body slumped against the stone, his face pale, his breathing ragged. He had taken a bullet to the shoulder, a serious wound that was bleeding profusely.
Dario,
she cried, rushing to his side, her heart filled with fear. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain. Alessandra, he whispered, his voice weak. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said, her voice trembling. But you're hurt. She ripped a piece of her dress, using it as a makeshift bandage, trying to stem the bleeding. Her hands were shaking, her mind racing, desperately trying to remember the first aid training she had received years ago.
We need to get you inside, she said. To safety.
With the help of some of Dario's loyal men, they managed to carry him into the mansion, to his study, where they could tend to his wounds. The scene that greeted them was one of devastation. The study, once a haven of order and tranquility, was in chaos, its furniture overturned, its books scattered, its walls damaged by the fighting. But Alessandra focused on Dario, her only concern his survival. She cleaned his wound, applied pressure, did everything she could to stabilize his condition. As she worked, tears streamed down her face, tears of fear, of relief, of love. She couldn't lose him. Not now, not after everything they had been through. He watched her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. You saved me, he whispered, his voice weak. We saved each other, she said, her voice choked with emotion. The night had been a trial by fire, a test of their love, their loyalty, their strength. They had survived, but the scars of the battle, both physical and emotional, would remain, a reminder of the violence they had endured, the sacrifices they had made. But for the first time, they had faced their reality as equals. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 18. The Unmasking. With Dario wounded but stable, Alessandra took charge, overseeing the cleanup of the estate, tending to the injured, and ensuring the security of the remaining Famiglia members. She moved with a newfound authority, her actions decisive, her voice commanding respect. She was no longer the captive, the outsider, but a leader, a protector, a force to be reckoned with. As the dust settled and the extent of the damage became clear, a new wave of anger and determination washed over Alessandra. The attack had been a direct assault on their lives, their love, their future. She was determined to find out who was behind it, who had orchestrated the violence, who had dared to challenge their authority. She began to investigate, using her contacts, her knowledge of the underworld, her sharp mind to piece together the fragments of information, to uncover the truth. She discovered that the attack had not been a spontaneous act of aggression, but a carefully planned conspiracy, orchestrated by a shadowy figure who had manipulated the rival families, fueled their resentment, and provided them with the resources to launch their assault. The identity of this figure remained elusive, hidden behind layers of secrecy and deception. But Alessandra was relentless, determined to unmask the traitor, to expose the mastermind behind the violence. She spent hours poring over documents, analyzing communications, interviewing witnesses, piecing together the puzzle, one clue at a time. She discovered a trail of coded messages, secret meetings, and hidden transactions that led her closer to the truth. Finally, after days of tireless investigation, she uncovered the shocking reality. The mastermind behind the attack, the puppet master pulling the strings, was none other than Lorenzo Romano, her own father. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, a wave of disbelief, anger, and betrayal washing over her. Her own father, the man who had sold her into captivity, the man who had betrayed the Benedettis, was responsible for the violence, the bloodshed, the attempt on Dario's life. She confronted Dario with the truth, her voice trembling with emotion. "It was my father," she said. "He was behind it all." Dario, still recovering from his wounds, listened in silence, his expression hardening with each revelation. He had suspected Lorenzo's involvement, but the confirmation, the undeniable proof, was a devastating blow. "He will pay for this," Dario said, his voice cold and determined. Alessandra knew what that meant. Retribution, violence, a swift and brutal justice. It was the way of his world, the code he lived by. But she also knew that it wasn't the only way. There was another path, a path of forgiveness, of reconciliation, of breaking the cycle of violence and betrayal. "Dario," she said, her voice pleading, "please, don't do this. Don't let my father's actions destroy us. Don't let the past dictate our future." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He was torn, conflicted, struggling between his need for revenge and his love for her. "He tried to kill me, Alessandra," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "He tried to destroy everything we have built." "I know," she said. "But killing him won't change that. It won't bring back the dead. It won't heal the wounds. It will only perpetuate the cycle of violence." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on hers. She saw the struggle within him, the battle between his anger and his love, his past and his future. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping, his expression softening. "What do you suggest?" he asked, his voice weary. "Let me talk to him," she said. "Let me try to reason with him. Let me find out why." It was a risky proposition, a dangerous gamble. But she felt compelled to try, to find a way to break the cycle of violence, to heal the wounds of the past, to build a future based on forgiveness and understanding. She knew that by unmasking her father, she had also unmasked the biggest challenge of her life. And she had to decide if winning meant saving him or destroying him, because both had the potential to shatter her future with Dario. Chapter 19. Crossroads of Destiny. Dario, despite his initial reluctance, agreed to Alessandra's request. He understood her need to confront her father, to seek answers, to try to break the cycle of violence and betrayal that had plagued their families for so long. But he also warned her of the dangers, the risks involved in facing a man who had proven himself to be ruthless, manipulative, and consumed by hatred. Alessandra, armed with a mixture of fear and determination, arranged a meeting with Lorenzo, a clandestine encounter in a neutral location, a small, unassuming church on the outskirts of the city. She went alone, unarmed, trusting in her ability to reason with him, to appeal to whatever shred of humanity might still remain within him. The meeting was tense, fraught with emotion. Lorenzo, his face etched with bitterness and resentment, greeted her with a mixture of scorn and disbelief. "So, the capo's whore has come to plead for her father's life," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Alessandra refused to be provoked. She met his gaze, her expression calm, her voice steady. "I came to understand, father," she said. "To understand why. Why you did this. Why you continue to fuel this cycle of hatred and violence." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the empty church.
"Why?"
he asked. "Because they deserve it. The Benedettis, they took everything from me. My power, my honor, my family." He spat out the last word, his eyes filled with a burning rage. "They took your mother, Alessandra," he continued, his voice rising. "They killed her, and they left me with nothing." Alessandra knew the story, the distorted version of events that Lorenzo had clung to, the lie he had used to justify his actions, his betrayal, his hatred. "That's not true, father," she said, her voice firm. "You know it's not true. Dario told me the truth. You betrayed them. You colluded with their enemies. You were responsible for Isabella's death." He scoffed, dismissing her words with a wave of his hand.
"Lies,"
he shouted. "All lies. They have poisoned your mind, turned you against your own blood." She saw the desperation in his eyes, the fear, the delusion. He was trapped in his own web of lies, consumed by his own hatred, unable to see the truth, unable to escape the cycle of violence he had perpetuated. "It's not too late, father," she said, her voice pleading. "You can still choose a different path. You can still make amends." He looked at her, his expression softening slightly, a flicker of something that might have been regret crossing his face. "And what?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Beg for their forgiveness? Crawl back to them? Begging for mercy?"
"No," she said.
"Find peace. Find redemption. For yourself, for your soul." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. She saw the struggle within him, the battle between his pride and his conscience, his hatred and his love for his daughter. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. I don't know how," he whispered, his voice broken. It was a moment of vulnerability, a crack in the armor of his hatred, a glimpse of the man he once was, the man he could still be. "I will help you, father," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "I will help you find your way." The meeting ended without a resolution, without a clear path forward. But it was a beginning, a step towards healing, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Alessandra returned to the Benedetti estate, exhausted but determined. She had faced her father, she had confronted the past, and she had emerged with a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to breaking the cycle of violence, to building a future based on forgiveness and understanding. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had Dario, his love, his support, his strength. And together, they would face whatever the future held, united by their love, their commitment, their shared destiny. The crossroads had been presented, and she chose a path that would lead to Dario's ultimate test. A choice between family and her. Chapter 20. Redemption's Embrace. I am asking to give him a chance to heal the future. Alessandra knew that her request was not easy, that she has to change his perspective. "He is a dangerous man, Alessandra," he said, his voice wary. "He has proven that time and again."
"I know," she said.
"But I also believe that people can change, that redemption is possible, even for the most hardened hearts." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on hers. She saw the conflict within him, the struggle between his anger and his love for her, his past and his future. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping, his expression softening. "I trust you, Alessandra," he said. "I trust your judgment. If you believe he is sincere, if you believe there is a chance for peace, then I will support you." It was a concession, a significant step forward. He was not offering forgiveness, not yet, but he was willing to suspend his judgment, to allow Alessandra to pursue this path, to try to heal the wounds of the past. With Dario's cautious approval, Alessandra continued her efforts to reach out to Lorenzo, to help him find a way to atone for his actions, to make amends for his betrayal. It was a slow, arduous process, fraught with setbacks and challenges. Lorenzo was resistant, stubborn, his pride and his hatred deeply ingrained. But Alessandra was persistent, unwavering in her commitment to breaking the cycle of violence, to building a future based on forgiveness and understanding. She spent hours talking to him, listening to his grievances, challenging his assumptions, guiding him towards a path of reconciliation. Gradually, slowly, Lorenzo began to change. He started to acknowledge his mistakes, to express remorse for his actions, to take responsibility for the pain he had caused. He began to see the world through a different lens, to understand the consequences of his hatred, the futility of his revenge. The transformation was not complete, not instantaneous, but it was real. He was a broken man, seeking redemption, yearning for forgiveness, reaching out for a second chance. Alessandra, with Dario's reluctant support, facilitated a meeting between Lorenzo and the heads of the other families, a council of judgment and reconciliation. It was a tense, emotional encounter, filled with accusations, recriminations, and expressions of grief. But in the end, a fragile peace was brokered. Lorenzo, humbled and contrite, offered a formal apology, a pledge to renounce violence, a commitment to rebuilding trust. The other families, weary of the conflict, cautiously accepted his offer, agreeing to a truce, a chance for a new beginning. The reconciliation was not perfect, not complete. The scars of the past remained, the memories of betrayal lingered. But it was a start, a step towards healing, a glimmer of hope for a future free from violence and hatred. Alessandra had achieved the impossible. She had broken the cycle of violence. She had brought peace to warring families. She had redeemed her father, and she had secured her future with Dario. As they stood together, hand in hand, watching the sun rise over the Tuscan hills, they knew that their journey was far from over. But they also knew that they had each other, their love, their strength, their shared commitment to building a better world, a world where forgiveness and understanding triumphed over hatred and revenge. And, for the first time, they had a shared future. It was hard-won and had cost them tears and blood, but it was theirs. Epilogue. Epilogue. Years passed, seasons turning, painting the Tuscan landscape with their ever-changing hues. The Benedetti estate, once a battleground, a scene of violence and destruction, had been restored to its former glory, its scars healed, its gardens flourishing, a symbol of resilience and renewal. Dario and Alessandra, their love deepened by the trials they had overcome, had built a life together, a family, a legacy. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, who grew up in a world where peace and understanding reigned, where the cycle of violence and betrayal had been broken. Dario, transformed by Alessandra's love and influence, had become a different kind of capo, a leader who valued diplomacy over force, negotiation over violence, justice over revenge. He had maintained his power, his authority, but he had used it wisely, responsibly, guided by a moral compass that Alessandra had helped him to rediscover. Alessandra, no longer the captive, the outsider, had become the heart of the famiglia, a respected and beloved figure, a source of wisdom, compassion, and strength. She had used her intelligence, her empathy, her unwavering commitment to peace to heal the wounds of the past, to build bridges between warring factions, to create a better world for her children, for her family, for her community. Lorenzo, redeemed by his daughter's love and forgiveness, had found peace in his later years. He had lived a quiet, solitary life, seeking atonement for his past actions, dedicating himself to charitable works, helping those in need, trying to make amends for the harm he had caused. He had never fully reconciled with Dario, the wounds of the past too deep to heal completely, but he had found a measure of acceptance, a grudging respect, a fragile truce. One warm summer evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the Tuscan hills, Dario and Alessandra stood together on the terrace, their arms wrapped around each other, their children playing nearby. "We did it," Alessandra said, her voice filled with emotion. "We broke the cycle." Dario nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his eyes filled with a mixture of peace and contentment.
"We did," he said.
Together. They had faced the darkness, they had overcome the past, they had built a future based on love, forgiveness, and understanding. They had created a legacy of peace, a testament to the transformative power of love, a beacon of hope for generations to come. Their life had been a testament to the power of second chances, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring strength of love. And in the end, the past was about betrayal. But their future, that was about redemption. And that was written together,